Hi, church family. Today we are in Psalm 89. Psalm 89 is one of those Psalms that feels very current for me because it's a Psalm that addresses the tension that all of us feel between the way things ought to be and the way that they really are, between the glorious, awesome promises of God and life in this broken, dark world. And so if you haven't had a chance to read it yet, I would encourage you to do so. It's going to take you some time. It is the third longest of all the Psalms. So pause this video after you read it for yourself. You can come back. I will keep my comments brief. Well, I said I was going to keep my comments brief, and you might be thinking that doesn't sound like me, but I am going to try my best. So here goes. Psalm 89 is a great psalm because it, like I said, addresses that tension that we all feel, like between our theology and reality. Like there are things that we know that are true about God, things that He has sworn by His character and by His name, and yet then we look at the brokenness of this world and we're left in the middle trying to reconcile our theology and the reality of just a messed up, broken world. That's where the psalmist finds himself in Psalm 89, which begins sort of as a royal psalm, like built on the foundation of the promise made by God to King David in 2 Samuel 7, where he promised him that there would be someone from his family line sitting on his throne, ruling the nations for eternity. And so the first 37 verses kind of celebrate the faithfulness of God, like the faithfulness of God's love, the faithfulness of God's power, the faithfulness of God in His ability to save His people. And so for the first 37 verses, that's the kind of sound of this psalm. And then in verse 38, everything changes. You see, up until verse 38, the psalmist seems to be building on this theme of the faithfulness of God that has its crescendo in verse 35, where God speaks and says this. He says, "Once and for all I have sworn by my holiness, I will not lie to David. His offspring shall endure forever, his throne as long as the sun before me." I've made a promise to King David, and I will keep my promise. I will not lie. And yet, at verse 38, the psalm seems to turn on two words, and those two words are, "but now." Like up to this point, the psalmist has been looking at the past, looking at the promise made to David, and now he's looking at his present reality, and he says this, "But now you have cast off and rejected. You are full of wrath against your anointed." And that really captures the theme of the rest of the psalm. As the psalmist looks at his life, remembering the promises of God, and then looking at his present reality and wondering why this tension, why this conflict. In fact, some scholars believe that the first 37 verses were written around the time of King David, and that this psalm wasn't completed until hundreds of years later while Israel was in exile in Babylon. One thing I really love about Psalm 89 is that it ends without reconciling the tension that the psalmist feels. Like he could have attempted to kind of explain away the promise that God had made to David, or maybe even to just say that maybe God doesn't have to keep the promises that He makes. He doesn't try either of those. Instead, he ends by asking God to remember the promise that He had made. He ends by waiting for the Lord in anticipation for God to answer and to keep His promise. And can I just read to you from Jeremiah 31? This is how you reconcile the tension between the first part of the psalm and the last part of the psalm, between the promise and the reality, between theology and what we experience. In Jeremiah 31, we get to hear the answer that the psalmist was longing for. We get to hear the answer to the tension that we all feel between our theology and our reality. And here's the answer. It says, "The time is coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. It will not be like the covenant that I made with their forefathers when I took them by the hand and led them out of Egypt, because they broke my covenant, though I was a husband to them, declares the Lord. This is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel after that time, declares the Lord. I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. No longer will a man teach his neighbor or a man his brother, saying, 'Know the Lord,' because they will know me, from the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their wickedness, and I will remember their sins no more." That's the answer to the tension. Wait for the Lord. God bless you, church.